written his first book of poems, won the 2002 New York New England Award. His next, Mixology, you can buy most of these right out there, was one of the winners of the National Poetry Series and was published by Penguin. The Big Smoke, also by Penguin, uses the life of boxer Jack Johnson, the first African-American heavyweight champion, to examine, among other things, racism, celebrity, and toxic masculinity in contemporary America. This collection was awarded the 2014 Anisfield Wolf Book Award, and it was also nominated, or finalist, for the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim and the Lannan Foundation, among others. He teaches now at Indiana University, and is still?
Yeah.
And is still Poet Laureate of Indiana. Nothing happened on the way here.
That's right.
His most recent book, A Map to the Stars, is something of a coming-of-age story, chronicling a boy's yearnings for interstellar space travel with meditations on race relations and the future. Throughout, Matejka incorporates his Star Trek nerdery in poems with titles like Stardate 8107.15. In one of these, the speaker says, "Either I'm a red shirt or I'm the captain." And for those of you who don't speak Star Trek, what this means is if you're, a red shirt, you're expendable, you're just one of the people in the background, you get killed all the time, whereas if you're Captain Jean-Luc Picard, you're captaining the Enterprise, and that's awesome. Matejka's poetry, it seems to me, extols the virtues of the captain. That is, it reminds us what all good poetry and all good literature's prime directive is. That is, to seek out new worlds and boldly go where no one has gone before. Sorry.
Yeah, man. To seek out new life. It's so good to be here. Thank you, Chris, for that. And thank you all for spending some of your time with me. Is this okay if I speak this way? I don't want to stand behind the podium. It stresses me out. It makes me feel like I'm teaching class. So thanks again, Francis Marion, for having me here, and to the PD Festival. This is really wonderful. I got to spend the day with brilliant scholars and writers, and I couldn't ask for more than that. I'm going to read a few poems, a couple of new poems, some poems from Map to the Stars because we talked about it, and I got to read something about Star Trek now. And then I'm going to spend the second half just reading from The Big Smoke, and I've got a video that accompanies that. But I want to start out with a poem called Bullet Parts that I'm dedicating to all of the people who have been part of this endemic of gun violence in the U.S. If you don't know about armaments, there are 4 parts to a bullet. And it's the primer, the propellant, the case, and the bullet itself. So what we think of as a bullet is actually just a part of a bullet. It's a full-on different thing. Bullet parts. Primer. It's made out of brass and lead. The bullet base is made from brass that otherwise could have been used as a classroom doorknob or a cheap necklace at the state fair or a wobbling spittoon. Or molded into new French horns in the underfunded youth band. No solos for the hornists, but they are still vital to the orchestra. At the center of the brass base, an igniter made out of lead. An expired igniter always lights it up, but lead could have been scratching old-time love letters or flaked in the cheap paint at the edges of the periodic table of elements in the back of a public school classroom. PB atomic number 82. It's right there, lining Roman aqueducts and wine vats. It's right there, holding nuclear reactions and their significant radiation as close as a needy friend. Walkman batteries running out of the middle of the slow jam again. The voices get thicker and deeper as the lead sheds. In some other life, the bullet primer might have been many different shapes of wonder. Propellant. It's either gunpowder or cordite. Gunpowder, like poetry, was mistaken for an immortality potion. Poetry, like gunpowder, was first used to light up the sky with every color inside a summer window. 700 AD, and the first propellant welcomed the new year with combustible surprise and eye-covering brightness. Gunpowder. They thought it was a new medicine to raise dragons and open palm stars bird level to the sky, while cordite Cordite can't be anything other than the killer it was mixed up to be. Since 1889, nitrocellulose, nitroglycerin, and petroleum jelly, a murderous clique. Cordite is only good for killing. Since 1889, cordite has made killing safer and easier for the red-faced killers. Case. It's made out of brass or steel, and we all know that from the detective shows where they find it and we discover it. But it's just one part of a killing machine. Case. Brass again, wishing to be a lost key or a better Victorian decoration. Brass again, wanting to alloy in a gentle fashion. Or steel taken from ship sides with the skeletons of skyscrapers. Steel can be a fish-shaped architecture full of cheering fans or car bumpers bent by their own inattentions after the lost match. The stop sign they didn't slow down for in their frustrations. Forks for the grub at the local establishment, butter knives for the drunken disagreements, and nerves steeled by beer. Abs of steel, too, in the old commercials on the TV in the corner. Not many bullets, though, if the city is one of those places where only the cops have guns. Bullet, and this is the last part of it, lead and alloy. Lead in the belly, copper and nickel skin. The bullet is a thin onomatopoeia for itself. Lead belly wrapped in a thinning, gritting Freedom Amendment. The gun is always more important than the people in front of it. So many black women and men in front of it. Boxes and boxes of ammunition, piercing and exploding. Boxes for the guns, boxes for the eroding targets, boxes for the 10 billion bullets built in the U.S. each year. Enough bullets to kill most of us twice each year. The bullet breaks the air with 2,182 mile-an-hour missions. The bullet hits 3 times faster than we can hear its bloody conclusion. It's real talk. 10 billion bullets every year. But it's actually more than that because they don't know how many bullets are manufactured by people themselves. So, in places like Montana and South Dakota where people just arm themselves that way, where they can build their own bullets. So there's at least 10 billion bullets. It's a downer, but it needs to be said. So my new book is called Hearing Damage, and I was thinking about the sounds that damage makes, and that's one of the reasons that I started working on this poem about bullets. I'm going to read 2 of them, and they both are titled Hearing Damage because I'm lazy. Y'all know that movie, Say Anything? Do you remember this movie? John Cusack is holding up the... So you'll know where I'm going with this. Hearing damage. I had a trumpet shaped like a downward heart, all of its dented iterations of brass and bell, 3-valve marginality, marching band possibility pointing at the muddy dirt. I had a vernacular as overachieving as a kid with a boombox in the rain. The trench coat was there. The wet socks, the look of wonder were all caught up in high school's ghost gears, greedy for their own moments of attention. And it never worked. When the tape deck got soaked, the tape stopped playing. When the music stopped, her shades barked as they shut, as if attention itself had been magnetized and then stretched around eager reels and fed into the machine. Click, 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 as if my bleeding waterlogged pleas weren't trumpets for attention, but gentle quarter notes clipped into polyester tinsel, future twists of glory. And with that, I'll do one more about how broke down I was in high school. This is called Hearing Damage again. Hearing damage begins with loud-mouthing the old vernaculars, I think. Washed-up catchphrases lapped by the waves as they recede into the water's sparkling mezzanine. Meanwhile, the adjacent hangers-on at the veranda of the slow sea pick through wobbly music and eyeliner smudges, searching for bent consonants in the analog. At the kitchen table, half-finished sandwich sitting in recriminating crumbs. I'll never love anyone again, the teenage version of me said after my girl left for a student council representative. There is not much else to say after calling love by its given name as my nearly divorced parents tried to outloud each other in the front room. The tap water was tepid in the sunlight that day. The slow jams were sad and woozy on the turntable while these white tulips I bought to get her back lilted in my fist. I don't know. You get left for a student council rep, and it's kind of a wrap. There's like really nothing else to do about that. Becky and I were talking about this poem, so I'm going to read this poem called Mail Order Planets. It's a little bit of a downer too, just to keep it even, like stay on brand today. Yeah, so everything in Maps of the Stars happens between 1981 and 1988, except for one thing. There's a poem in it there's a Prince poem in the book, and in the Prince poem I put his birth and death date because it's Prince. And he's more important than keeping that conceit going. So this isn't that poem though. Mail order planets. In 1981, Eris's Space's face hadn't been discovered yet. My mother hadn't taken a day off from Fort Benjamin Harrison yet, and Pluto was still a planet. One of the 9 celestial bodies snapped into drummed orbits around the sun, like the orthodontic rubber bands no one in Carriage House had. I hid my gaps by not smiling, imagining an astronaut future as sharp and as fixed as a dentist's smile. 236 miles above Earth, where up and down are instructions instead of directions. Behind a mirrored visor, the singing inside my American-flagged extravehicular mobility unit so robust it could keep a black boy from Indiana breathing in outer space. We didn't have any solar system models at PS 113, so I had to go get my own. I dove into dumpsters searching for cans and bottles under the OJ cartons and maggots and fat swallows of juice. I dug through the frozen dinner boxes and apple cores shaped like moldy infinities, then foraged the iced-out underpass, M&M hearts Kim, painted in moon-eyed red, then X'd out in black paint by the time the frost went away. I hunted the ice in tire-clogged creeks where I would have played spin the bottle with Cynthia from science class if I wasn't chicken. The A&P paid by the pound, and I dragged sacks stuffed with sand-filled slits and tab cans around back to where the brace face sweating on the scale knew my game and paid me anyway. 3 months of collecting, and I had enough money to order our system from the back of a Star Trek comic. All 9 planets in adjustable orbits, and Earth's majesty anchoring the third lane. The kid in the ad was as excited as I was, waiting for the mailman every day after mailing my 5 wrinkled bills, but the solar system never came. Stardate 8107.15. And so I did some work. This is important, right? I did some work to try to figure out how Gene Roddenberry came up with the Stardate numbers. And there were all these like fan sites. What he did was, and Gene Roddenberry's like, I didn't do anything. I just made up numbers. And I just made sure the made up numbers were consistent in each episode. So all of the star dates are the date backwards. That's what my star dates were. So this was on, it's like European dates. So I start with the year, 81, and it's the 7th month, 15. Down in the wrinkled creek with the broken crawdads and claws and crushed heeled beer cans. Down in the creek below the burnt out house with half a black wall and part of a chimney still hanging around with Garrett and Cynthia and tenacious mosquitoes buzzing like a radio stuck between channels. I can't come up with enough reasons to run back up to the bridge. Either I saw something between the trees or I saw something in the stinking creek. Either I'm a red shirt or I'm the captain. Either I can hear my mother call or I saw a molester peeking from a drain pipe. Stranger danger, but once you stutter, it does not matter. Stranger danger, and it smells just like a dumpster down here. When it rains, the sewer pipe dribbles Indianapolis scraps right into this creek. That can't be good for the minnows. Fat gray clouds mean rain. My mother is calling me. I won't hear her down here. Those are excuses probably. Garrett found an empty beer bottle and he's spinning it on his palm like a propeller. He's laughing at me again. Cynthia found a cracked branch spreading like Vulcan fingers and she's toe deep in the logical overflow. It looks like she's about to call an orchestra to attention, but she's slapping an unfortunate crawdad with her knuckled split stick. So I grew up in Section 8 housing, and then my mom married my stepdad, who was the vice president of Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we moved out to the rich suburbs. So we went from nothing to something for real. So you hear these little baby or somebody talking about how they came from the muck. I mean, I really did. And one day we had no food, and then the next day we had everything, and it was so confusing. I'm glad for that confusion, don't get me wrong, but it was confusing. So I'm gonna just read 2 more poems from this, and they're after we moved from Section 8. We moved out to the burbs, and the first one's called Record Changer, and for those of you that didn't have record players, a record changer was like an L-shaped device you put on top, and you could stack records on top of that, and they would drop down so you could keep playing instead of having to change the record all the time. And inside of this record player, in this, I'm gonna step on my own joke, but just tell you that I mentioned Fleetwood Mac's album Rumors in this poem, which was a big deal for a lot of people. The dude whose house this is set in had 4 copies of Rumors, and he would just stack them. Right? So that's what's going on in this poem, right? And also, I'd never been to a barbecue before this poem, so that's the other thing. Record changer. To the left of the neighbor's barbecue, variations of the same house ringed by the same foliage, adolescent bushes, their green tufts of low-lying sky. Dads, red-faced and bearded in the back someplace, turning pure meat over hot coals. The record players inside, wood box speakers propped in the windows. To the right, across the still-seated yard, our 2-story, just as square and as impeccable as the rest. We want Prince, but Rumors keeps restarting itself. Now here you go again, you say. My neighbor asks, now where'd you come from again? And we say California, like Fleetwood Mac. And nobody asks anything else. And because we don't hunt for dinner in the suburbs, we put down our implements of half-step and appetite, sidestep the moon as it descends into a whole plate full of charred thighs and wings. We collectivize the back in the day's ways as tenaciously as chicken legs undress themselves at a cul-de-sac party, then raise those strip bones up to history. Out here, there isn't any history, so history is whatever you want it to be. And this is the next morning. It's called Strange Celestial Roads. It's after a Sun Ra song at the same time. There's a father sleeping it off in every master bedroom of the cul-de-sac the morning after, so Saturday morning is a snooze. The moon is still out, eyeballing the quiet streets like Sun Ra did his orchestra. Somebody has to be a father figure for all these musical notes. No school buses to huff after, no mothers yelling their children onward. The only weekend noise is us, kicking rocks. So bored we can't hear each other on a celestial swirl of asphalt that will be a playground one day. We stand, right feet extended in unison like boozmen, rock after rock, arcing at sorry angles toward the open bar that hopes to dangle 4 swings. Some rocks go through, some miss as we balance on concrete meant to backstop hopscotch and echo knock-knock jokes. Not somebody's father yelling, "You got to be kidding me," after he opens the property tax bill. These bars were placed here for some other future kids to be dragged from by big ears or hair-matted necks, back to the unavoidable arguments, the fist-to-face noises, and the sweet, bleating saxophones that come after. So that's what it was like in the 80s. So I'm going to spend the last bit of time that I have, like the last maybe 10, 12 minutes, reading from The Big Smoke. And the whole book, as Chris mentioned, is about the boxer Jack Johnson. And it seems really useful and important to me to tell you, as we're in this place that has been reclaimed from its former life as a plantation, that Jack Johnson's parents were slaves. So he was the first generation after slavery. And he came from that to become one of the most famous people in the world. I mean, infamous, really. And so he won the heavyweight title in 1908 by beating a guy named Tommy Burns, who was 5'7" and 170 pounds. And Jack Johnson was 6'2" and 220. But back then, anybody over 170 was a heavyweight. He quit school in 3rd grade to become to go start making money. So he taught himself how to speak Italian. He taught himself how to play the viol classically. He taught himself basically everything that he needed to know. All right, so I'm going to see if I got this right. We were going through this trying to figure out how to do it. All right, there we go. Get it? Yeah, that's Jack Johnson. All right. I'm going to stay back here so I can keep an eye on this. This poem is called Battle Royale. And it's all these poems I'm going to read are in the voice of Jack Johnson. Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck won't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike, and since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in a bear garden. So the handlers sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it seemed like I got hit from 8 directions. I didn't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard, my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said, only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. So about the time that Jack Johnson was doing this stuff, a lot of technological changes were happening. Cars became a thing, telephones, like lots of stuff happened around Jack Johnson, and he was a huge fan of cars. He used to brag that he could wreck one and buy another one the next day, which was not possible. I'm about to read a poem called Prize Fighter where he talks a little bit about that. But he said that in 1908, there were 100,000 cars in the entire United States, and Jack Johnson owned 5 cars. It's like more than the state of South Dakota or something. Prize Fighter. I love horses because they will outrun the fastest man. They are majestic, as stately as a Saturday woman before a party. Horses smell like what it means to be fast, sweat and gravel kicked up on early morning runs, the in and out of breath like gravel in tired lungs. I groomed and raced horses from Texas to Philadelphia till one broke my leg bone with a back kick. Thanks to that break, I can't ride anymore, and even if I could, we got these automobiles now, and they can carry us a mile a minute. I'm buying the fastest one I can find once I get my money together. I'm like an automobile in the ring. My fists work like cranked up engines. I've got the kind of elasticity other fighters dream about when I put them to sleep on the canvas. When I clinch a man, it's like being swaddled in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I can't tell if these horses are happy or confounded by this new means of locomotion, but I can say with certainty, my prize fighting cohorts are decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. It's a direct quote, decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. And yet this dude had to go through life trying to convince people that he was actually a human being. So Jack Johnson was notorious for a lot of reasons, not the least of which he was married to a white woman. And he also had 2 white mistresses who would travel with him. And one of my friends told me that I shouldn't get such a kick out of that. It's just so funny to me that somehow this guy survived when he's doing this thing that's completely, sort of antithetical to the way that white America wanted things to be back then. And he's not doing it once, not twice, but 3 times, and they're all traveling together. His wife didn't know, though. He'd tell her he was going to train, and he'd go see one of his mistresses. And then he'd tell her he was going to go train and go see the other one. He's a busy dude. But one of the things that he would not deal with African-American women, he wouldn't deal with black women at all because the woman he loved the most was black, and she played him out, and he never got over it. And this poem's about that. It's called Fisticuffs. Some reporters say I fight yellow, but I don't need to use the dirty tricks. I don't rabbit punch a man's manhood like Mexican Pete or gouge their eyes out like Klondike. Their kind of fighting isn't fighting at all. It's like trying to sell a toothless man a gum shield. I wait for the punch instead. I move to one side, then punch back. Left hook straight to the temple. I named that punch after the first woman I ever loved, Clara. No man has met my Clara and was still standing to talk about it. The woman quit me. She took my jewels and her roll with me. I took the train all the way to St. Louis to get her back, just so she could take the rest of my money and leave again. Claire is the reason I don't deal with colored women anymore. I never had a colored girl that didn't two-time me. It seems a little bit extreme. I'm just going to read a few more of these. So the fight that you see right here is was the fight where he won the heavyweight championship. So he's fighting, the guy's name is Tommy Burns. And you see how much bigger he is than him. And the poem I'm going to read is 2 sonnets, back to back. And it's called A Great Maltese Cat Toying with a White Mouse. And that's a quote from the way that they describe this fight. And you see him smiling. I don't know if you can tell that he's got gold teeth, but he's smiling, just laughing at him, talking smack, which they used to call mouth fighting. A great Maltese cat toying with a white mouse. What I told the reporters. I had no doubt about the outcome after the first round. The only surprise was how long Tommy Burns stayed on his feet. He was a game man and showed no inclination whatsoever to quit. My fists were better in every round, and I landed punches that I thought would bring him down. But like a great pachyderm, he refused to stop. And because he was so game, I was glad the police ended the fight. I wanted to be heavyweight champion, not injure Burns seriously. What I really meant. That man made me chase him from Texas to England, all the way to Australia before he would fight me. Poor blusher. He didn't win the title. He just happened to be white and in the right place, like somebody striking gold. I put him down, but gently in the first round, so he would know what to come when his knee got up off the canvas. Once he collected himself, I bruised him with my right, and I talked to him all the while. Walk right into him, Tommy. Left hook to the gut. That's a boy, Tommy. Straight right to the cheek. Take your medicine nicely. So I'm just going to read two more because that's 30 minutes. I really want to read this. Okay, I'm going to read a poem about his teeth, and then I'm going to read one last poem. Okay, so I told you he's got gold fronts, right? And you can't really see it, but in a second he's going to about knock him out, and then it stops. Because he's just hemming him up, right? But they stopped it so that nobody would see a white man get knocked out by a black man. And so that's it. They cut it off, and so nobody could ever see him actually hit the canvas. All right. So this is called Gold Smile, about his gold teeth. And I got a quote from Shakespeare, who was his favorite author. Teeth hadst thou in thy head when thou wast born, to signify thou camest to bite the world. And that's from Henry VI. They call teeth dent in France, and the name makes sense the way teeth do what they do to bacon and shoulders and cakes. The French word for gold is or, so when the folks in Paris describe my smile, it sounds like what happens when I punch a door. Dent's door. Dent's door, the French children say when I open wide. Dent's door, Etta said when she locked herself in the powder room. Tommy Burns said Dent's door when I was hooking him into asking for forgiveness. His people back in Canada would have said the exact same thing if they were in Sydney to witness our spectacle. Before I got these gold uppers, I told Tommy the only reason I got them was to make every bite of my food twice as expensive as it used to be. Complicated dude. All right, so this is the last poem I'm going to read, and it's called Il Trovatore. Il Trovatore was Jack Johnson's favorite piece of music, and he had this white valet named Gaston who would carry around a gramophone, like one of these big old record players you had to crank, and have him follow him around cranking this gramophone, playing Il Trovatore for him while he was training, which is hilarious. But then, Gaston had an affair with his wife, and then nobody ever saw Gaston again. My dude was like, he booked out of there once Jack Johnson found out. So Jack Johnson's wife was named Etta, and she pops up in this poem. Il Trovatore. The first time I heard the aria is like sunup after the great storm, the woman's voice rising, then rising some more, as if the want of it all wouldn't allow her another breath. Like road work when you've punched yourself out. Like Tommy Burns catching my gut hook. Like the first I saw of Etta. Like the sound of the crowd in Reno when Jeffries couldn't go on. Like going up the steps of the Cafe de Champion after a crash of gunshots in Etta's rooms. Like finding Etta on the floor, a halo of blood getting bigger by the minute. Like the nurses not nursing, but crying and pointing at the gun, still hot in Etta's own hand. Like Etta still breathing, whispering a libretto on the heels of her last breath. You did this, Papa. You did all of this. Thank you. It's too bad that you can't see him knock this dude out, but I think we're supposed to have a conversation too. But I just gotta tell you something really gross, but it's true, and it's in that poem. In that fight that was just wrapping up, the guy's name is Stanley Ketchel, and they decided to try to double cross Jack Johnson. The fight was supposed to be fixed, and he decided to try to double cross him and knock him out. And so Stanley Ketchel lights Jack Johnson up unexpectedly and just lays Jack Johnson out. So then Jack Johnson gets up and hits this dude so hard he knocks his teeth out. And in the video, you can see him brushing the dude's teeth off of his gloves. Yeah, boxing is not that sport. It's for real. And so it went from being fake, like they were supposed to be toying around, to being so real that this guy was out missing teeth and everything. Boxing at the turn of the century was slowly different. So, how do you see this, Chris?
So we'll just open the floor up for questions, or I can begin, but we'll see what people have to ask.
Just throw a whole bunch of stuff at you. I'm gonna keep sitting up so I can see you if that's okay.
Well, I certainly have some questions. Maybe I can kick it off. You want a weirder, or weirdest question?
I think the weirder is a good place to start.
Weirder is a good place to start. I'm just kind of wondering, not too long ago, what's his name? I don't know his name. Rocky, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
He calls up President Trump and says, "Will you pardon
Yeah.
Jack Johnson?" He goes, "Yeah, who?" Right? And I'm just kind of wondering, like, what you kind of envision is like this kind of next, within the world of this book of poetry, how such a thing speaks to the kind of racial relations you're trying to think about through Johnson's story.
Yeah.
At that time, but also now,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like these two white dudes like finally get this pardon
Yeah.
for Johnson, right?
Yeah.
One of whom for sure doesn't even know who he is, doesn't care, and I'm just kind of wondering like what that kind of speaks to in terms of what your work is trying to do.
Yeah, that's a really good question. 'Cause I was thinking about the fundamental fact about that pardon is that if Jack Johnson were alive right now, he would be the exact athlete that Donald Trump would be attacking. Like you heard him going after football players. You hear that's how his attitude. Jack Johnson was that times 100. So he would. This dude, Jack Johnson wouldn't have liked him, and he wouldn't have liked Jack Johnson. It's just a fact. But Sylvester Stallone comes in and it's like, hey, and then immediately after the pardon announced that he's going to make a movie about Jack Johnson, because what we really need is another movie made by someone who's not part of the community about a famous figure, right? We were talking about this, I think, earlier about The Great White Hope. There's a movie, there was a play that won the Pulitzer Prize and then also became a movie with James Earl Jones. It takes all of the salacious stuff from Jack Johnson's history. Like, it's about a black boxer with a white woman, and there's all this domestic violence and stuff in it. And it makes Jack Johnson out to be this kind of country bumpkin, when in fact he was not that at all. And they were so far removed from who Jack Johnson actually is that when the play came to Chicago, where Jack Johnson's buried, they wanted to take his hand-picked gravestone out. It just says Johnson. He's in Graceland Cemetery with the guy who invented Otis elevators and the person who created Pullman cars for trains. It's like this captains of industry, and there's Jack Johnson, right? They wanted to get rid of his chosen gravestone and replace it with one that said Lil Arthur, which was this racist name that sports writers used to call him, and he hated it. And so these knuckleheads who were in this play thought that it was their purview to go and change this man's space of rest, right? That's how far off that can be. And so, I don't know. Sylvester Stallone, I know he likes boxing.
He likes playing.
He likes playing a boxer. I liked Rocky back in 78 or whatever that was. He was good as a backup singer in Creed, but it was really Michael B. Jordan who did all that work. But so the idea that he's going to somehow understand the complexities of Jack Johnson's experience, I did a terrible job of explaining him to you in 12 minutes. He's so much more complex than this, in great ways and also in despicable ways. And so, what drew me to this to begin with after I started working on the project was Hurricane Katrina. I was reading some, this was about the time I started in 2005, and I was reading some newspaper articles about, the Superdome. And for those of you that remember this, they were talking about all this murdering and looting and all this like rape and all this stuff happening in the Superdome when none of it was actually happening. It was just people saying it was. I found this while I was researching Galveston, where Jack Johnson's from. There was a storm there in 1900. The Great Storm of Galveston. It just wiped it out, right? Wiped the whole place out. And the descriptions of what happened after it could have just been, they could have just photocopied them. And it was exactly the same conversation. Like, there's all this murdering and looting and raping and pillaging, and none of it was happening there either. But it's this version of blackness and black culture and community that is very easily passed off to people in the most despicable ways. And so when I saw that, I was like, not that much has changed. Like, what's happening right now? And this is when President Obama was in office, and they're still like, yeah, it hasn't changed that much. I'm glad he's here. I never would have thought I would have seen it, but, it really hasn't changed that much.
Well, there's a question. There's a question.
How did Johnson react publicly? How did he present himself publicly?
There's a lot. One of the things that has changed really radically is what the conception of a gentleman is. Because we don't have it anymore. In fact, then it was a major part of the way that people operated in the world. And so Jack Johnson was always resplendently dressed. He was always as clean as could possibly be. He he worked to become cultured because that's how you do. Like, if you're a gentleman, you speak another language. If you're a gentleman, you travel the world. These are the things you do. And so Jack Johnson did those things, taught himself how to be that person. And, there's a poem in the Big Smoke about the Titanic. Like, Jack Johnson really wanted to be on the Titanic, and they wouldn't let him on because he was black. He's trying to buy a ticket for him. He's trying to buy his wife a ticket. They will not let them on. And then it sinks, right? And then the musician Leadbelly writes this song, The Titanic. And in the song, Jack Johnson is standing on the dock dancing because he wasn't on this ship, sort of celebrating it. And that was incredibly offensive to him. He's like, I would have never done that. Like, I would never sit there and dance when all those people died. Like, it's just not what a gentleman does. So in the poem, originally I had this thing where Jack Johnson's like, all right, I'm going to fight my way on this lifeboat, and Ed are going to be on it and all this kind of stuff. In the morning, I was sending the manuscript in for its final twist. There was a thing on NPR about it happened to be the Titanic. It was some anniversary for it. And the whole piece was about the one man who got on the lifeboats. Like, I don't know how much you all know about the story of the Titanic, not that corny movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, but the actual thing, right? There was room on the lifeboats, but only elderly people, women and children got on the boats. All the men stayed on the ship and went down with it, because that's what a gentleman does. So I had Jack Johnson fighting his way onto this lifeboat and all this stuff, which was just factually inaccurate and wrong. Till the day I was about to turn it in. And I know it would have been someplace reading that poem and there'd be some Titanic nerd who would be like, well, that's not possible. Because that's what I would do, like about Star Trek. So, but the story about this guy I don't remember his name, but the one person who got on this boat, he killed himself like 3 years later because every place he went, he got shamed for being the guy that got on the lifeboat. No idea. So the conception of what a gentleman was and the way he presented himself was very different. It's not like athletes now. Some of them, I guess, present well. I was thinking about how elegant LeBron James is in the way that he deals with the world. And you think about somebody who started out, it's like a little kid. He's like 18 years old, like wide-eyed out of Cleveland, Akron. And, to go from that to being who he is now is so incredible to see that evolution.
Could you talk about, because you've got two very different books there.
Yeah.
One is about memories of being a child in the 80s.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of them is basically a bunch of dramatic monologues.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that you don't run into too many books that are entirely dramatic monologues these days. Although I would argue that that's a form that, with slam poetry and such, has really gotten a resurgence in recent decades. What is the different mindset you have to put yourself in to write a book of dramatic monologues versus a book of memories?
Yeah.
Or shaping
That's
memories?
that's really great. Thanks for asking. I mean, so it took me. It was really hard to write the book. It took a long time. It took me 8 years to write that book, and I wanted it to be right, and I wanted it to be respectful of the history, like the lived history inside of it. I didn't want to disrespect the good or the bad. I wanted all of it there without judgment. And so one of the things that I learned while I was writing it was, it's somebody else's story. I'm trying to treat it ethically and respectfully. And in order to do that, I have to stay out of it. So the further removed I was from it, the better the poems became. Like, the less I interjected and tried to make arguments inside of the poems, the better the poems were, because he wouldn't do that. You know, so he would beat his wife, but he wouldn't try to justify it. He would it's just what happens. So I was trying to get him to apologize in poems. He would have never done any of that. So the further removed my agenda was from the poems, the better the poems seemed to operate, right? And when I got done with it, I was like, all right, so I just put all this dude's business out in the streets, and I won't even write about my own stuff. That seems disingenuous, you know? So I can tell everybody about all his dirty stuff, but I won't even talk about being poor when I was a kid. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So when I went back to start trying to, I was working on them at the same time. I was finishing the Big Smoke while I already started Match of the Stars, and I was working on mixology when I was working on Big Smoke. So I usually work on 2 projects at once, in kind of opposition to one another. And so it led me to a couple of choices. One is that there's a kind of personal narrative poem in which the speaker has some kind of realization, right? Can be like, this happened, and that's when I realized that I would never be a kid again, or something like that. And what I wanted to have happen is none of that. Like, what I wanted was to just tell a story, and then that'd be it. So the poems, if they work the way I wanted to, the poems in the Big Smoke are Jack Johnson telling you how he feels about things. The poems in Map to the Stars are me trying to tell you a story about something. And hopefully you'll extrapolate the same thing that I did from that. So I think the judgment, permission, point of view, those are the 2 major differences. That and the fact that I didn't have to go through all the drama he went through to write that. And so Chris mentioned that the book was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I was thinking about this, like I'm grateful for that, of course. But it's very clear to me that it's not me. It's his story, the same way that this terrible version that Howard Sackler wrote won the Pulitzer Prize. There's something about his story that's quintessentially American in a way that it seems to resonate when it needs to resonate.
Can I piggyback on that question just very briefly then? It's a question I asked in an earlier session, which is the question of like style and authorial voice.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can reflect on that given what you said, because I'm thinking about, if you read a Robert Browning dramatic monologue, you're never going to mistake that for anything other than a Robert Browning monologue, right? Yeah. And there's a remarkable consistency in the Big Smoke, right? You never slip out of that, kind of that voice, right? And so it's kind of related to what she's asked, but what do you think about this issue of style or voice, because you just said, it's kind of not mine for the Pulitzer Prize or whatever, but at the same time it is, even through that kind of ventriloquy or whatever,
Yeah, there was, the voice in the Big Smoke was really tough because there are a lot of texts about Jack Johnson, right? But they kind of fall into 3 categories. He has these autobiographies that were ghost-written by a French guy in French and then translated into English. So they're like 3 steps removed from him, right? There are videos and audio recordings of him reading, but they're like really dramatically rendered. He's performing for the recording, right? And then there are these jacked newspaper articles where they flip his language and turn it into this kind of minstrel speak. They would have some of the most racist stuff. It'd be like an LA Times, and there'd be a cartoon drawing of Jack Johnson with a bone in his nose and a loincloth and a spear. Or Jack Johnson holding up a piece of watermelon with his big smile. Not in some country paper, but in the LA Times or the Dallas Morning Star or something. Just incredibly racist. And they would change it to fit, so they changed the language to fit the cartoon instead of just letting him speak the way that he spoke. Right? So when I was going back trying to piece this voice together, I was like, okay, he doesn't sound like an English professor translated out of French. Done. I know that's not it. He doesn't sound like buckwheat. Done. I know that's not it. Here's this performance. So I imagine it's somewhere in the middle of a couple of these things, pretty far away from the others. And so once I zeroed in on that voice, I was able to able to work through. It became less of a style and more of a fact. Like, this is what he sounds like. So now I'm going to move forward with it. And later on, I found this after I'd finished the book and it had been out for a little while, I found an unpublished autobiography that Jack Johnson had actually written himself. And so then I had his language, and I was like, oh, man, what if I got it super wrong? I didn't even open it for a while. I had it sent to me, and I was like, I don't even want to know. It turned out that I was really close, so it was okay, but I was really afraid that I'd done this wrong, you know. But as far as like the poems that are in my voice, whatever that means, it changes every book, I think. Like the difference between the poems I was reading from mixology this morning and those poems, for example, they're just different. They're different versions of me, so they require different language. How are we doing on time? I think we have time for like one more question.
Could you talk a little bit about the process of moving into the graphic novel that the project that you're in the midst of?
Yeah, it's really hard. Like I thought I was gonna knock this bad boy out in like 6 months. It's like, so I'm working on a graphic novel. So when I started working on The Big Smoke, I knew that there was too much material for one book, and I knew I couldn't write another book of poems. Like I already did that. I discovered the things I needed to discover in the poems. So doing it again would be a bad sequel. We were talking about sequels earlier, right? Like if this would be a terrible sequel, because I couldn't replicate the surprise that I had as I was learning about this stuff. And I was sitting with my editor at a party, and somebody was talking. I said, "You know what it needs to be? It needs to be a graphic novel." And he's like, "It needs to be a graphic novel." And you know, and I've been reading comics and collecting them like my whole life. So it's like, well, I read them all the time. How hard could it be to write one? It's like that's a mistake. That kind of hubris is how people end up in jail. You know? I was like, man. And so this started in 2015, and it's finally going to be out in 2021. Like it's finally going to be out this spring of 2021. And right now, like tomorrow, I've got a bunch of edits that I've got to do tomorrow afternoon somehow. But it's just this constant process. I'm working with an illustrator named Youssef Dowdy who lives in Paris. So we do everything across time zones, across languages. But I knew for a fact that whoever, I needed to have a black illustrator do the work. I needed that for the same reason that I don't think Sylvester Stallone should be messing around with Jack Johnson's story. Yeah, he did, like I said, he was good in Creed. But it's a totally different thing. Like writing a script for a graphic novel is like writing a movie script. So I'm writing it with like, you know, exterior day, all of these cues for the illustrator, and then he just goes nuts. And it's gonna be 320 pages long. And it spans from about 1910 to 1930, but has flashbacks in it. So Jack Johnson, after he got convicted of a thing called the Mann Act, which was bringing a woman across state lines for the purposes of prostitution, because one of his girlfriends was a former prostitute, and that's how they got him. Was they couldn't beat him in the ring, so they got him for this Mann Act. He had a year and a day that he was supposed to serve in Leavenworth, and he was like, "Okay, I'll be right back." And he split and moved to Europe with his wife, and they sent some of their cars over there, and they just were having this fabulous time. And then World War I broke out, and he's in France, and the French are like, "We love you, Jack Johnson. You just need to join the French army and fight for France." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go to Spain." So he goes to Spain, and he's there, and World War I ends up there too. He moves to Mexico, ends up in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. I mean, this dude was just everywhere, and things were popping off around him as he's just kind of cruising around. And the Department of Justice followed him that whole time. I have this file that they declassified about 10 years ago, that's 500 documents. It's just telegrams and letters from these agents, and they're like, Jack Johnson's broke. We can pick him up and bring him back. And the government's like, nah. He'll come back on his own. Just keep following him. And so he just followed him everywhere, making these reports on how he was getting more and more broke, and nobody would let him fight because he was on the run. So he's just losing money, and it's just incredible. It's like if the Big Smoke is the ascension, then this is sort of the, it's a little bit more of a downer. But he's hanging out with Pancho Villa. Like that feels like it needs to be seen, not just described.
He's still fighting in his 60s.
Yeah, he was still fighting. He was also a really, like y'all know Joe Louis, right? Like the brown bomber who donated all of his earnings for like 3 years to the World War II war effort. And as standard practice back then, they would waive the taxes on things for people who donated to the war effort, but they didn't waive it for him. So he donates all his money, joins the military, and comes back and has this substantial tax bill because they wouldn't waive it, even though he donated all his money to the war effort. So he spent the rest of his life fighting to try to pay off his tax bill, completely destroyed himself. Jack Johnson had a similar thing. Not as bad But after he went to prison and came out, the whole world had changed around him. And they were not interested in letting him fight for the title again. It's really fascinating. Read Ken Burns, see Ken Burns' documentary, Unforgivable Blackness. It'll lay it all out for you. And they've got Samuel Jackson doing the voice of Jack Johnson. It's really good. Hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.